You want to be pretty familiar with the ins and outs of that. We're talking about, the 1400s. If you go back, right, we know that there was a lot of population growth in Southeast, in Africa, right? We started out way earlier with the Bantu migrations to South Africa and the east coast of Africa. We know that farming, obviously, with metal tools, right, iron tools help population growth. Even though bananas were being grown in, Central Africa, and then that food source spreads, Southeastern Asian traders are going to bring bananas too. So the bottom line is you're going to see incredible population growth, mostly from, again, agriculture and the development of better tools. Islam is going to grow during the Abbasid Empire, right? So merchants from Arabia are going to travel to Africa. We know that the Trans-Sahara Trade Network is going to bring Islam to West Africa. So I would probably say, the Indian Ocean trade helped spread Islam to the coast of Africa, the East Coast, and the Trans-Saharan Network brings Islam to, Mali and Timbuktu much earlier. So the empire in 1450, which would be, encompasses what was Mali and Ghana, would be the Songhai Empire around 1450. Two famous leaders, Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad. And what you want to remember is that they had highly centralized governments, which is a change, right? So these African empires are going to become more centralized. They're going to be, Muslim empires. So Sunni Ali conquers Timbuktu, very repressive policies against anyone who was, an opponent or a scholar. And his empire was much larger than Mansa Musa's empire. Probably the ruler you want to remember would be Askia Muhammad. He is going to grow Islam even further, and he's going to use that to legitimize his rule. It's always important, whether it's Constantine or Askia Muhammad or a Justinian, right? In a theocracy, religion kind of increases their power, right? When they are the political leader and the religious leader, well, that's pretty much, you are the head person, right? You are going to be listened to and respected. And again, that's going to be used to justify, right? That you are somehow, whether it's divine right, or you are in this position of power due to your connection with either the prophets or the church. He's going to increase the number of mosques and schools, right, to grow Islam. He is going to promote toleration of other faiths, though, and that's a continuation of Islam, right? So definitely remember Askia Muhammad and how he grows Islam, and again a central, very very centralized government, not the size of the Byzantine Empire, but definitely a change in Africa. All right, Europeans start to arrive in the 1400s. Portugal, they're going to be the first to kind of start to establish trading posts along the African coast. Remember, Prince Henry the Navigator starts to spur on Portuguese trade. They're looking for this route to Asia by going around Africa. We know that Bartolomeo Diaz makes the first attempt. He doesn't make it to Asia, but he does explore the coast of Africa. And we know Vasco da Gama does make it to India. But along the way, these explorers are going to establish these trading posts. And while they're there, they're going to be basically kind of being exposed to the slave trade, right? Africans were already trading slaves. The Asante Kingdom and the Dahomey tribe were using slaves from war. So the Portuguese started to purchase those slaves. Eventually, those slaves would go to their colonies in Brazil and along the coast of Africa. Slaves were traded for gunpowder, weapons, and that's going to be the beginning, right? So we kind of, the Portuguese are basically the initiators of the African Atlantic slave trade. So a little bit about, culture in Africa. Oral history is very important. The griots were storytellers. We talked about the griots in the last chapter on Africa. These stories are going to influence European poetry and novels. So these stories are going to be, exchanged, um, you know, through trade, right? Whether it's the Indian Ocean trade or the Sub-Saharan trade. Um, it's important too that as Africans were brought over to the Americas, they're going to bring these stories, these oral histories, and that's going to be important to maintain their culture, right? So remember the griot, the storyteller. We're not going to see African hardback, books, but the oral stories is what's very important. And again, those stories are going to make their way to the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade. In the African communities, having a slave was a sign of wealth and status. But again, and the Portuguese weren't the first to purchase slaves. Arab merchants sought slaves on the Swahili coast, right? That's this is the eastern coast. And then obviously the Portuguese are going to jump in the 1600s. Here you go, right? They're going to bring their slaves to Brazil. Obviously, the Spanish are going to bring their slaves into the, Central America, Mexico, mostly the Caribbean, though. Why Africans? Well, one, whether it was Portugal or Spain, they had these cash crops that were important to them, right? Sugar, tobacco, and they needed labor. Native people were not effective. They were not akin to hard labor. They succumbed to disease more quickly. Obviously, they're living in their own territory. They knew how to escape. Africans were new to the territory. They were, rice farmers. They were already farming in Africa in extreme heat. So they were better conditioned for this type of work. And they were actually immune to those European diseases. So definitely a profitable and effective source of labor. We do know about the indentured servants, right? They also made their way over. Because they were not that effective in Virginia, they were kind of rebellious at times. Their contracts were not permanent. Even American plantation owners sought a new labor, sought slavery. So again, another reason, right? American Indians and these English indentured servants were ineffective. So we talk about the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is the big piece, right? The exchange of goods and ideas. And obviously bringing slaves over to the Americas, that's part of the Columbian Exchange. The triangular trade is more, I think, related to mercantilism, right? So it's this trade network that develops in the 15 and 1600s, even the early 1700s, right? Where, all of these regions or continents are going to be working together. It's actually a great example of globalism. So, obviously England has colonies and they want to bring raw materials from those colonies, and they do. So you're going to see, like whale oil, lumber, fur coming out of the American colonies. That's going to be used in England. Obviously, lumber would be to build homes, right? As population grew in England, there was less land and wood. They're also going to bring over, obviously, rice, silk, eventually cotton, right, for their textile machines, and they're gonna send out manufactured goods, mostly clothing, guns, definitely guns, clothing, silver, alcohol like beer. Obviously, from Africa, you're going to have slaves being transported. In return, you're going to have those manufactured goods coming over. From the Caribbean, you're going to be basically, trading slaves for raw materials in North America. So all these regions are interconnected in this trade network. Okay, so definitely kind of know what region provided, right? Finished manufactured goods from Europe, raw materials from North America, slaves from Africa, slaves from the Caribbean, right? Also, don't forget what's coming out of the Caribbean: sugar, right? In North America, especially in Philadelphia, you had rum distilleries. They would make rum. You needed the sugar and the molasses from the Caribbean. So everyone's interconnected. All right, an interesting, we read an excerpt from King Afonso. I'm not sure what it was. I want to say a DBQ, but King Afonso was the ruler of the Congo Kingdom in 1526. He was using, obviously he was engaged in the slave trade, the inter-African slave trade, but also, his kingdom was trading or was involved in the Atlantic slave trade. But he was concerned, and he voiced his concerns to the government of Portugal. He didn't want to see, young members of his society being taken away. He feared depopulation, losing young, strong men and women, right? So he actually, tried to, stop or slow down this slave trade. He also was concerned about his own power. He didn't like that his own subjects were trading with Europeans without his involvement, without any kind of regulation. So I think he felt like maybe Portugal was kind of starting to, not necessarily take over, but have a little too much influence, at least economically, in his country. I'm sure long term he always feared that maybe Portugal would colonize his kingdom, but he is someone that, he didn't stand up to the Portuguese from a moral standpoint. More, he was concerned about losing his own power and it affecting his kingdom long term. So try to remember King Afonso, not Alfonso, but Afonso. All right, so what about this term diaspora? We always think of Jews and migrating force, because they're forced out of their communities. The slavery is a diaspora as well, right? So when African slaves come to America, they're going to maintain some of their customs and culture, but they're also going to synchronize or assimilate. They're going to mix with Spanish, right? A Spanish African mix is a mulatto, right? So what you're going to see mostly in the Caribbean is a new language, Creole. It's African language combined with European languages, whether it's Spanish, French, or even English. It's interesting that in South Carolina and Georgia today, in some parts of those states, some African Americans speak Gullah, which is an ancient Creole language. You're not going to see that though, or you didn't see that a lot in North America because there were fewer slaves. So you're going to see less. You're not going to see a lot of this diffusion of language. So as far as religion goes, we're going to see, again, a continuation of syncretism. Again, the combining of Christianity with West African traditions, whether it's drumming or dancing or spirits that are going to be kind of intertwined with Christian, Christian churches. The African American church is going to emerge in North America. And that church is going to maintain some of these, old West African traditions. Van Dun in Haiti, we mentioned that in the last chapter, right? Combining the local religion, animism with obviously Catholicism. The Candomblé in Brazil, which is a combination of Catholicism or Christianity and the traditions and religions of the people of Nigeria. Also, it's African slaves that are going to be bringing Islam to the Americas. So we give them a lot of, not credit, but we always remember that, right? This diffusion, which eventually leads to syncretism. And again, all of this is an example of a diaspora, right? African culture, African people, moving forcibly to the New World and bringing with them their culture, which would be religion, language, food, music, art, all of that, right? They're also going to obviously adapt or adopt Christianity over time, or English, right? All right, as far as music goes, modern American music was influenced by West African culture. Music was used by slaves and probably in Africa as farmers to help endure their work. Later on in the Americas, it would be used to communicate or organize or communicate rebellion. And the idea of a Negro spiritual, it's this idea that European Christianity combines with African music, right? So in a church service, you might have, again, a great example of a combination of African tradition integrating or using more music and dance in a church service, right? The Puritans were not singing and dancing in their church services, but over time, some Protestant churches, Baptist churches in the South are going to adopt, maybe a livelier service. And the banjo, right? The banjo is a great example of a musical instrument that has its roots in African music. All right, so the end of the slave trade does happen. Really, by 1888, slavery is pretty much extinguished. Not only in the Americas. Obviously, the United States abolished slavery in 1863, right? Lincoln and the 13th Amendment. The Haitian Revolution definitely speeds this up. We'll get into that down the road. It's the French slavery system ends in 1804. Even our Constitution abolishes the slave trade. Not initially in 1787, but it did, have a timeline for that. I believe it was 1807-ish. And a lot of this is because of the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment ideals that not only that promoted or inspired the American Revolution, the French Revolution, but also it spurred on an abolitionist movement in Europe. So that's important. All right, so overall, you definitely could see an essay about slavery's impact. And I think, obviously, the impact was negative for Africa, obviously, right? Depopulation, increased poverty, economic problems in Africa when you lose a lot of people, obviously. Obviously, the guns that were brought over obviously contributed to more civil war. In Europe, obviously, it benefited them economically. It contributed to the rise of capitalism or private ownership. English steamships made a lot of money. Not steamships, English, shipping companies made a lot of money transporting slaves and all these goods. Triangular trade definitely helped Europe, and, slavery drove the triangular trade. And then obviously the Industrial Revolution, cotton, American cotton grown or picked by slaves would definitely be used by the English in their textile factories. Obviously new syncretic cultures in the Americas. I don't know, if African people would justify slavery in any way, thinking that it somehow created a new culture, but it's more about the impact, not necessarily negative or positive, but how things changed. And I think that's the key word, change. How did slavery change the world, right? And you're going to have new cultures and customs developing in the Americas, good or bad. And obviously cotton helping the United States becoming an industrial power. America, our founding fathers were wealthy because of what their slaves did. America was born on the back of the slave. All right, so that's it, guys. Take good notes. You'll have a quiz next.